I'd like to thank all the organizers, the president and vice president, and the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Fulbright program for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure. He's looking at that, those pictures there, and I'm going to be speaking about that today carefully. I am a diplomatic historian, okay? But I want to ask, what can diplomatic history and international relations theories tell us about the future of the United States in the world? It's something that, since the election, we've been very interested. Many people very bothered by that, but certainly very interested. And particularly, we want to understand what is the impact and what will be the future of the Trump administration in this world, and probably something that interests all of you, I hope. I will try to answer that from a historian's point of view, which is very dangerous because it's very recent. Okay, but I'm going to talk especially about trade, something that President Trump has focused a lot on, and that trade history as a way to perhaps give a warning about the Trump administration and what could happen. I'm going to focus on an aspect of the Trump policy that I will call very strident, very intense economic nationalism. Economic nationalism. And then specifically, I want to address the 1930s, the era of the Great Depression, and the mistakes made in trade and financial policies then, as a means of providing context to Donald Trump's America First, or Made in America policy. And it's a America First trade nationalism. That's very intense. I think that in history informs us of the possible consequences of his approach to the global economy. And I'm sorry to say, I think it offers some very sad lessons about nationalism and the dangers of nationalism. Some have argued that Donald Trump is a realist, in which America will picket, United States, America, excuse me for saying America, I know that's very nationalistic. U.S. nationalism. That the United States will pick its battles very carefully, rather than engage in intervention everywhere, or idealism and idealistic missions, or globalized economic policies. No. We won't hand jobs over to foreigners like you anymore. We'll save them for the United States. Wise, realistic citizens, some 63 million of them, voted for Donald Trump. Though that was a minority of the voter total, many of them voting for him to overcome what they saw was the oppression of globalization, of which the United States has been a leader. That nationalist thinking, though, which is disguised as realism, threatens to ruin our institutions and sources of power. Actually, the United States would be hurt by an end to globalization. And that's something realists should never want. That argument also neglects the fact that one can criticize globalization without abandoning globalization itself. Certainly, we know, you know here, that globalization and government policies always need reform and change. Perhaps one answer to changing or improving the economic system is to look at domestic sources of economic power. Better tax policy, for example, infrastructure building, adjustment for workers hurt by trade. I think we should be very careful about blaming trade or American foreign trade partners for the problems with our trade policy, or for workers laid off. And why do we blame trade policy? Because it's very easy for U.S. Americans to blame foreigners. This is a president, obviously, who has threatened to build a wall against immigration. So it's very easy for his base to look and say, that is the cause of our problems. those people in Argentina or Mexico or China or Europe. I think that's a mistake to blame trade policy. We're probably more to blame for his voters were our free market policies over the last 30 years or so. Outright free market policies that benefited business and hurt and crushed the working class. The lack of labor unions in the United States was one problem. So not trade policy, I think. Failure to help American workers over the last 30 or 40 years, and globalization has taken off, is a tragedy. That failure to help American workers build themselves a competitive economy with widely shared benefits has been a failing. Okay? The real problem, though, in danger of realism, is that it is being trumpeted by a leader and an America that has long been the historic leader. Going back in the last 3/4 of a century, the United States has been the leader of stability, order, peace, and free trade in the economy. The United States built a record of opening itself to imports. Okay? And surely, of course, it expanded its exports and its trade too. We can get in an argument after this about whether the United States is an imperialist power, and this is imperialism, but that's a different issue. That's a different issue for me. But we did this. We did this not only to help the American economy, which by and large doesn't depend all that much on trade, but we did it to build political relationships, diplomatic relationships, security in the Cold War, for example. And that was very important. Give you an example for Argentina. Despite the fact that leather apparel goods captured nearly all of the American market in 1993, by 1993, all those leather goods, and put out of work about 160,000 US workers since the 1960s. The presidential administrations from John F. Kennedy to Bill Clinton refused to raise trade barriers against Argentina and Hong Kong and Brazil and Mexico and Taiwan, who sold us these leather goods. One reason was there was a concern that economic problems might make it very hard for those countries to transition to democracy. And it would destabilize the political environment and Cold War security. Excuse me. I'm cold here. This could certainly be uncomfortable and hypocritical. Relations warmed between the United States and Argentina during the Reagan years in the 1980s, despite the fact we knew Argentina's history of the dirty war in the 70s and before. But we believe that free trade policy of letting in Argentine products in those leather goods was critical to Argentina's turn from a military to a democratic government, and that we would hurt Argentina and its political stability by becoming protectionist. We would hurt its debt repayments, and we would certainly make sure that Argentina was strengthened as a Cold War ally. If you go back to World War II, in the 1940s in US-Argentine relations, the two countries signed an agreement in 1941, just as the United States was joining World War II, was about to be attacked. And trade was cut between Argentina and Britain. So there was very little trade between Britain that was at war and Argentina. And Britain, of course, was Argentina's major trade partner. Argentina agreed to lower tariffs on over 100 items. The United States lowered its tariffs on nearly 100 items. And the US even allowed Argentina to delay its cuts of tariffs until it had enough revenue to a certain level. So even after World War II, when that revenue increased and Argentina got wealthier, Argentina did not lower its tariffs. Many in America said that that was protectionist, that we should punish Argentina. But American presidents said no. They said no. in World War II, by the time Argentina ended its neutrality in 1944 and joined the war in March 1945. And after it, in the Cold War, we believed that we needed Argentina as a partner against Hitler and against Stalin after the war. And so it was silly for us, a country that didn't depend as much on trade, to become protectionist. So where does that get us to Donald Trump? And I'll talk some more history later on. In the 2016 election that featured a remarkable emphasis on foreign policy, a country on immigration, trade, climate change, terrorism, WikiLeaks, Russia, China, Iran, and Trump's inaugural address in January of this year that focused or was dominated by international relations. It was remarkable. This in a time when foreign policy is not all that important to Americans right now. We're not at war. Now, we control terrorism, that war will never end. But it's not as much of a formal war. We're not under attack. But foreign policy was critical. We need to take stock, though, of what's happening, where we've been. History has proven that an American-first strategy can get us off the tracks and dangerously slow. There are never parallels to historical eras. There's never parallels to today, 1930s or whatever. You can't have that. But we can learn lessons because history often involves the intersection of geopolitics and socioeconomics and economic forces. And there are personalities there too that are important too. So let me try to make sense of history very quickly here. When it comes to Trump's populism and chauvinistic nationalism, there is an old saying in the United States. I hope it translates in Spanish. Been there, done that? Does that understand it? Been there, done that? And I'd add, we did it badly. And it worked out really badly for us and for the world. The upsurges of chauvinistic or nativistic nationalism that burst from populism are obvious danger to democracy. And they grew even more. You heard more of it in the United States after the attacks on September 11th, 2001. And Americans, in a way, closed in and got, actually had a lack of confidence about our mission in the world in the last 15 years. And so you now have this president 15 years later who has less of an ideology and more of a campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," which was a catchy campaign phrase, but actually Ronald Reagan used it in the 1980 campaign, 1984, "Make America Great Again." So it wasn't new. And once he became president over this last 6 months, I believe it's been a simplistic way, overly simplistic way, to bring order to the complexities of the world economy, and retain favor. During his first 6 months, he has disguised an American first term by not capitalizing the second word. Okay, and then he has been referred mainly to Made in the United States or USA or Make America Great Again. Trump continues to use that term, fixated on protectionism, as if the rest of the world is attacking the United States through its trade policy, and promises jobs for Americans only. He promises to let in only, or have Americans buy much more superior, supposedly American goods over foreign ones, and to stop the robbery of American wealth and ingenuity and employment from predatory foreigners like you. And I think this is other blustering, foolish, and rather narcissistic utterings, because I think behind this is a lot of a continuing campaign. I don't know if he's fully aware of what he's saying. An ahistorical commentary by this president. I think Trump brings out the worst of America with his apocalyptic utterances, because they may lead to the kind of isolationist policies that are inimical to America's role in the world and America's real interests. As the 1930s demonstrated, it is unrealistic, even in today's age of interconnected economic relations, and one in which is often the case, that a manufactured product, the products that Donald Trump's focusing on of manufactured American goods, don't actually come from the United States. They are component parts that come from all over the world and are assembled in various ways too. So it's even hard to protect yourself against foreigners when a lot of these products are made elsewhere and sort of assembled in a lot of places. It is inward-looking, it is anti-foreign, and it is certainly detrimental to American interests. Protectionism is. It could be today as it was years ago. If you take the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership that the president pulled out of 3 days after his inaugural address, the TPP as it was called, that was a pivot to Asia to promote growth and promote the economy, obviously. But it was also designed to end corruption, child and forced labor, protect workers' fundamental rights, curb poverty, and promote human rights, to try to give an alternative to China in the Pacific as an alternative trade and power center. And as the Secretary of Defense said at that time, Ash Carter said, the TPP is trade's version of an aircraft carrier, an economic guard watching over America's values and interests in the Asia-Pacific area. President Trump didn't agree. He pulled out of the agreement, and he said this: "It is the policy of my administration to represent the American people and their financial well-being in all negotiations, particularly the American worker, and to create fair and beneficial trade deals that serve their interests, America's interests." The TPP is all but dead, at least in terms of U.S. participation, and this was due to an America First outburst of rejection by Trump. This past January, some 1,000 civil servants in the U.S. State Department, across the government, but mainly in the Department of State, dissented in a cable message to President Trump's temporary travel ban, which you probably heard about, are banning certain countries on U.S. refugee program and immigration from 7 Muslim countries. The letter arose from opposition fundamentally to protectionism of any sort, whether regarding the flow of trade or people. Could so many experts be wrong? Could they be wrong? After all, confronted with a populist national fervor, elites have been correct before. Some 90 years ago, in 1930, over 1,000 economists from universities and the private sector sent a letter to President Herbert Hoover protesting the pending Smoot-Hawley tariff that raised tariffs supposedly to their highest level in U.S. history. The Smoot-Hawley tariff has gone down in history as the most protectionist legislation the United States has ever put forth. It actually didn't raise tariffs to the highest level physically, but it really went down. It was mainly the timing, because timing's everything. On May 4th, 1930, in that letter, economists countered that the rise in tariff rates and protection would be disastrous to a majority of our citizens by raising prices to account for higher production costs. The old protectionist free trade argument. And they said that people working in mines and food and agriculture and construction and transportation, tourism across the board would clearly lose out. That is the little guy and gal, the same constituents that President Trump says he supports, would lose out. Would lose out. They would remain unemployed. That was plain economics, said these economists. Yet there were those in favor of Smoot-Hawley. Obviously, it became law. Democrats and Republicans who endorsed protectionism. Some predicted a quick return to happy times. And one congressman said this: "The government cannot deny protection of the law to any of its citizens. That's government's job." Trump has essentially said the same thing, that is his job, is to protect Americans. Now, many analysts have downplayed the importance of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in subsequent history, arguing that trade doesn't really represent a whole lot of the American economy and that they weren't critical to the Great Depression, of course, that had started the year before, the Great Depression that lasted 12 years. And they didn't raise their tariffs to the highest level, went on and on. There was also no massive backlash overseas from other nations. Okay, there was not this tremendous wave of protest. So were those 1,028 economists wrong? Were they simply engaging in scare tactics and hyperbole to defend their doctrinaire beliefs in free trade as economists today. Most economists today are free traders. Did Smoot-Hawley serve the next president, Franklin Roosevelt's purposes in the 1932 election, a few years later? To say, that was wrong, Smoot-Hawley, and I will put us on a better course. Don't vote for Hoover, vote for Roosevelt. And that Republican protectionism is wrong. Was it political theater? Have economists, since Smoot-Hawley, created a plot, a secret plot, among them, among free trade economists, with internationalists after World War II, to always raise the specter, the danger of protectionism anytime that somebody talks about protectionism? Is it their goal to say, well, we're going to return to isolationism and bad things are going to happen? Perhaps, maybe that's all true. Maybe there is a secret plot. Maybe Roosevelt was playing politics. But timing is everything. That last 8 months when Smoot-Hawley tariff was considered by Congress in late 29 and 30, added to financial and market insecurities and resulted in 2 stock market crashes. Europe's world debts could not be paid, World War I debts could not be repaid as trade revenue dried up. Financial stability, especially in the American farm sector, was undercut, was ruined. And as Trump nationalists well know, focusing on the aggregate, the total impact of trade misses essential details. The forest does not account for all the trees. Only a fraction of world trade might be affected, but in specific sectors, protectionism could deal quite a blow to the economy. The key was that when Smoot-Hawley passed, the message to the market was very clear. In the midst of the Great Depression, Smoot-Hawley was a nationalistic, designed to protect the American market from foreigners. We're seeing sentiment like that again. The American labor market might be great right now. I don't know if Argentina's is so great. The United States labor market is fine. But we are still living with the residue of the second worst downturn in global history in recent times, the Great Recession in 2007 and 9. And our economy, even the United States economy, still isn't moving along as well as we want it to. So you're getting the same rhetoric here that Donald Trump, perhaps he has read this history from the 1930s, and realized that that could be pretty popular. Diplomats also understood Smoot-Hawley's dangers, and nationalists certainly grasped its import. Within months of this legislation passing in 1930, Canada, France, Mexico, Italy, Spain, Cuba, Australia, and New Zealand all raised their tariffs. Exporters like Argentina were hurt, and there was a lot of protest made from Argentina to the United States. Reporting from Buenos Aires, the United States Vice Consul noted that Argentina had increased its tariffs on trucks, films, radios, refrigerators, though it said this was done to correct its overall trade imbalance. But it was directly targeted at the United States. 26 countries imposed new restrictions on trade. And the British, very famously, adopted their own empire network of trade that was very close system. These measures were a reaction to Smoot-Hawley. But most ominously, economists also warned that higher tariffs would undermine relations among friendly nations. And higher tariffs protections do not create soil for good relations and world peace. They had their evidence. 1931-32, just after Smoot-Hawley passed, Japan invaded Manchuria. But the biggest blows were about to come in the buildup of fascism and militarism. It would be very simplistic. I'm not going to argue that trade policy automatically led to the conquest by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in Europe. I'm not arguing that. Or that the Japanese embarked on their militarism because of Smoot-Hawley. No. Or that you had World War II, 65 million deaths because of trade policy. But it certainly played a role. It certainly played a role in undermining the capabilities of democracies. Amidst all the economic distress and lack of international cooperation, Hitler, Mussolini, Tojo, and Stalin took note of an disunified, feeble, selfish, democratic response of creating closed economies and shutting down trade, giving them space to prop up their totalitarian governments and their military spending. Nations viewed the world as a win-only mercantilist business transaction. It's all about a deal. It's an art of a deal. And the key lesson from history, however distant, was that the upswell of protectionism signaled the triumph of economic nationalism. And like trade policy today, it's a convenient excuse for struggling job seekers, and especially for populist politicians and demagogues. President Hoover acknowledged that fact, that he said our trade policy has been hijacked by domestic interests here in 1930. But he swore that the next Republican Congress, we will examine what is good for the American worker. We need to command the home market. Americans need to command their own market. The parallels today are evident. Donald Trump would agree with Hoover that platform promises, campaign promises, must not be empty gestures. And so in 2017, in his inaugural address, Trump very aggressively asserted the sort of trade nationalist outrage and an American first solution to U.S. problems. He was the first president to assert such nationalism in such a way about trade, or presidential candidate for that matter, in decades. Maybe Patrick Buchanan in 1992, a Republican candidate, but you hadn't heard that before. And just like Hoover, he said that every decision on taxes, trade, foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. But he also personalized Donald Trump, as only Donald Trump can do, personalized his national campaign. As he said, I will fight for you, Americans, for every breath in my body, and I'll never let you down. We'll follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American. So Trump went Hoover even one more. To Hoover's credit, he cared about the Republican Party at least. It's unlikely that Donald Trump cares all that much about the Republican Party. Probably cares much more about himself and his business interests and his family. Hoover actually thought of himself as an internationalist. He believed there were diplomatic solutions to these problems in the Great Depression. Trump, we see no evidence of that. And so for 3/4 of a century of American leadership over a liberal world order, Herbert Hoover basically embraced that, but the Smoot-Hawley debacle ruined that whole thing. Protectionism also caused nationalism in other areas, as it might today. Dictators might follow Donald Trump's example and push their own local, selfish, and dangerous agendas. It's a familiar story, as the president cavalierly looks at trade as a zero-sum game. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected in 1932, Hoover's successor, recognized the dangers of Smoot-Hawley. But he too turned inward, junking a World Economic Conference, ending that, and turning inward with his New Deal. You've heard the New Deal? It was a domestic, inward turning in which the United States would solve its own problems. Now, who's going to accuse Franklin Roosevelt of being a protectionist, or a nationalist, or an isolationist? Well, Herbert Hoover did, and others did at that time. It was part of a strategy to oppose the Republicans with something different, and part of a strategy about European debt and other things that are too complicated right now. It also spoke to Franklin Roosevelt's personality and decision-making style. Roosevelt hated dogma and abstraction. He had basic convictions. He cherished the American free enterprise system, and he could link trade liberalism to peace. But that was about it. He had about a centimeter's deep knowledge about international economic affairs. Not very deep. Very similar to Donald Trump. And he understood nationalistic statements would strike a chord among American workers, and certainly those who had voted for Republicans, and he needed them to vote for Democrats in 1932. So both New Yorkers, Donald Trump and Franklin Roosevelt, the two New Yorkers we've had as president most recently, have much in common. yet they don't share many personality traits beyond being unstructured and not very knowledgeable. Commentators have long known that Roosevelt at least was very optimistic. He smiled. He enjoyed being with people. He was very friendly. He wasn't a great intellectual, but he had a great feel for politics. Donald Trump, overblown rhetoric aside, is more of a narcissist, although Roosevelt was too. But he's been more of a pessimist who sees enemies everywhere. Enemies everywhere. Roosevelt didn't see that. Roosevelt didn't have that approach. He did end this World Economic Crisis, the conference. He did also offer a reciprocal trade barrier lowering program from 1934 that is in existence today. And he long regretted, though, his move to ultranationalism when he came into office. He said his decision to end that World Economic Conference and not cooperate with our allies did not indicate ultranationalism. Yet he was wrong. Roosevelt was wrong. Roosevelt didn't like international bankers, but they were the very ones who were going to solve this problem of the Great Depression. He believed that we needed to create an American internal economic system that was sound and stable before worrying about the international economy. He was wrong about that. Actually, Roosevelt didn't have any course in mind. He kind of winged it. He really didn't know what he was going to do, except he wanted it to look good in Pittsburgh and Peoria. Another expression. Does it play well in Peoria? Had to be, that meant for voters in Pittsburgh and Peoria. He disregarded principles. He didn't have sustained thinking about this, and at heart, though, Roosevelt understood that internationalism was the preferred course, but he sounded off in a defense of American interests anyway. It was uninformed and he was dangerous. And so a trade war emerged in the 1930s, took some time. Diplomatic relations in the international arena unraveled into a confused jumble of policies that fascist aggressors took advantage of. Roosevelt understood his mistakes and he turned things around quickly. But by 1936, 3 years or so into his administration, as dictators began to march across continents, Roosevelt connected democracy, peace, and freer trade. Just months after Hitler had taken the Rhineland forcibly, an Italian fascist had seized Ethiopia, and that Francisco Franco had launched the Spanish Civil War. All around the same time, Roosevelt gave a very famous speech in Chautauqua, New York, August 1936, about trade nationalism. And he said, you know, I don't say that a more liberal international trade will stop war. But we fear that without a more liberal international trade, war is a natural sequence. It's going to come. There is going to be conflict without that. In hindsight, this rhetoric acknowledged the pitfalls of nationalism and the crying need for international cooperation. You know, things didn't get much better. The infamous America First Committee of 1940-41, on the eve of American entry into World War II, sort of the big figure that was Charles Lindbergh, who wanted to keep America out of war, America first, and don't get involved in the European war. That group, even though Trump says there's no link to that group and his America First slogan, actually also questioned whether foreign trade was important to the United States. These isolationists said, not really. We need to worry about our production at home. And they argued that a withdrawal from the trade system would not be terrible. It's sort of preceded by 70 years, that kind of thinking, the notion of Vladimir Putin as the United States' friend. All right, and preceding that, the Charles Lindbergh, the America First Committee, noted that we can live side by side dictators. We're fine with dictators. They're not after us. We're fine with that. Even though the United States had been a close partner with Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. We traded with them in the 1930s, even with Stalin's Russia. But such thinking did not consider the fact that we helped the very nations that we would have to fight in World War II. We helped build them up. Likewise, the United States abandoned the Jews shutting down immigration of refugees who were fleeing tyranny in Europe. Such policy played very well in Pittsburgh and Peoria, in the heartland of the United States, even though we turned a blind eye to the fact that America could benefit economically from skilled and unskilled labor coming from overseas. It also expressed such chauvinism and even cruelty of economic nationalism, of protecting the home market from products and from people. So, where do we stand? One threat of such nationalistic approaches is that the messenger can oftentimes overwhelm the message. Demagoguery oftentimes walks hand in hand with nationalism, supranationalism. For example, using the bully pulpit of radio especially, Roosevelt attained hero status. Roosevelt's a hero. When he died in 1945, as you know, many of you know the history, people cried, they couldn't believe it. Who was going to be president? He'd been there for so long, and he was a hero. He represented, as he said, ordinary Americans. And he did so by the radio, bypassing traditional print journalism, newspaper journalism, and spinning his own events, spinning his own version of events. He could do that. He was very skilled at that. But at least FDR faced real threats. A Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in 2 centuries, and then World War II. 2 of the 3 greatest crises the United States has ever faced. The third being the American Civil War. Trump is a different type, though he shares Roosevelt's skills in marketing with new media. Very famously, he's capitalized on the calamitous Great Recession and places himself squarely as the hero rescuer through trade nationalism in part and immigration barriers. While Roosevelt used radio, Trump resorts to Twitter, bypassing traditional media that's almost impossible to keep a handle on. And he directly addresses his audience and amplifies his message in what is called by some scholars the attention economy. The attention economy of mass media, of television shows and an endless news cycle. In this milieu, a dramatic, and that's what it is, and he's been very skilled at this, I guess. His dramatic America First message thrives, especially when he talks about economics. Trump threatened 70 years of liberal internationalism against the protectionism of Smoot-Hawley and non-participation in world economic conferences, as well as the prejudicial, head-in-the-sand American First isolationism. Adherence to liberal values truly made the United States great as the guardians of a global economy that, despite its faults and inequalities, a lot of faults in the world economy that America presided over, no doubt, but still, it muffled nationalism is the greatest danger to try to spread benefits to everyone. This is called democratic peace theory. Democratic or capitalist peace theory. And it posits that trade and finance are tools of foreign policy. Not anything unusual, but something we should remember. It's not a new concept. That theory stretches back centuries in philosophy. On occasion, capitalist peace doctrine promotes unity through global institutions, themselves in need of constant reform and responsiveness. It has also achieved America's interests, too. Now, President Trump threatens to make America a hated, reviled, and counterproductive international pariah that risks upsetting the global order. Although he's got one thing going for him. You can't ignore the United States. No matter how bad it might be, you can't ignore it. It's just too big and powerful of a country. Nationalism is a powerful tool that only can end in disaster. We should learn from this history. Rather than President Trump's views that we're getting ripped off all the time, as he said, as he proclaimed alongside a visiting prime minister, we should think the opposite. We should know that automation and productivity and long-term trends of a decline in blue-collar worker welfare have been the real problems with the American economy. It isn't trade. Computers, in other words, computers rather than China are the problem, or at least the challenge to deal with. Okay, and that efficiency that comes with it. Trade barriers, raising them, will not reverse our fortunes. It won't reverse the worker fortune, probably make them worse, because those very workers they're designed to help also shop at places like Walmart or need cheap goods to buy. They're consumers too, so it's going to hurt them. Threats to trade might succeed in the short term and maybe kind of be dramatic and make some foreign countries listen to us, but they can lead to reprisal. What will follow, history tells us, is a more hostile international environment of recrimination and undermining world trade rules and norms, and a rise of nationalist leaders who will prompt a backlash against American interests. It happened when Smoot-Hawley passed, and now we have signs of retaliation today. They exist in Mexico and China among leaders now, talking about it. Canada has already been polled and are primed to meet US trade barriers with protectionism of their own. Say Canadians, we're fine with that. We're fine with that too. And that will weaken US influence, and even threats to security and peace are much more likely. So, we had a second chance after World War II to abandon this sort of revolutionary isolationism and protectionism. Will we get a third chance if we head down the road of President Trump? Maybe he's just spouting rhetoric, as Donald Trump is very good on Twitter of 3 in the morning, spouting stuff and just saying all this stuff. Maybe it's just rhetoric to appeal to his base, as Hoover and Roosevelt did. Still, even Roosevelt's reversal and his trade law didn't help matters. It was too late. It was too late. And the trade regime was devastated. Maybe President Trump will tone down his protectionism. Maybe he'll make side deals with countries like Argentina and say, okay, you got to limit some of your goods, but overall I'll be a free trader. All presidents have done that. Though his continual reference to making the country great again, as a single focus on Americans, doesn't bode well for that. If he does not shift his gaze away from hyped up nationalism, he risks once again foreign retaliation, diplomatic tensions with key allies in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Making America great again would in sum ruin the trade system and damage the US economy, workers, farmers, and businesses included. That would be bad for Pittsburgh, for Peoria, and for world peace. Thank you.